In the wasteland, nowhere is truly sacred. Years ago, when much of the earth was still pristine, prospectors from near and far would devote their short lives to seeking their paradise. Older civilizations would teach their children about these hallowed lands, places far removed from the horrors of the world they had known, an escape from the monotony of their everyday life. But as time went on, and the world's focus shifted more to consumerism, the search for paradise was slowly replaced by the daily grind. It's hard to find the promised land when you're working 2 jobs just to make rent. As a way to still scratch that age-old itch of running off to some better place, many pre-war thrill-seekers instead opted to venture into the wild, traveling to any number of pre-war nature preserves or state parks. In a way, these places were a kind of paradise. Maybe not a promised land, but still, a place where folk could forget the struggles of everyday life and find some sort of peace. Paradise is where you make it after all, and no place was closer to that than Zion Canyon. After the bombs dropped, Zion was cast into the same darkness as the rest of the world, smothered by radiation and burned by atomic fire. Though unlike so many other places, Zion began to heal. In time, after decades of slow progress, Zion Canyon began to look a whole lot like it did before the war. Once again rich with plants and wildlife, and home to some of the only clean water in this wasteland. In time, even the radiation cleared, leaving Zion almost as pristine as it was before the bombs. This proved to be especially useful to the dominant tribe in Zion, the Sorrows. The Sorrows tribe lived off the fat of the land for years, taking advantage of the wild animals, plants, and clean water native to Zion. Though they had little contact with the outside world, that would soon change when 2 men came to join them. Joshua Graham and Daniel, 2 missionaries from a place called New Canaan, found refuge at Zion, both among the few survivors to make it out of their home alive. New Canaan had been effectively destroyed by a group of tribals called the Whitelegs, under the orders of Caesar. The 2 men, along with a few other survivors, hoped to make a new home out of Zion, and to keep the memory of New Canaan alive. Though unluckily for them, their troubles had followed them. The Whitelegs, determined to destroy all traces of their people, followed Joshua and Daniel into Zion, beginning a campaign of destruction against both them and the Sorrows tribe. Though Joshua and Daniel heralded from the same home, the 2 men held very different beliefs. Daniel believed that they and the tribals should shun violence and abandon Zion altogether, while Joshua believed that the only answer was war. Joshua had seen plenty of warfare in his day, and knew that he and the rest of the survivors could only run for so long. Instead, he argued that they should militarize the tribals living in Zion and destroy the Whitelegs once and for all. The 2 men argued for days on what the right course of action was, but it wasn't until the courier arrived that a decision was finally made. Joshua and his new friend from the Mojave ended up going behind Daniel's back and recruiting the Sorrows for the war against the Whitelegs. Backed by both the Sorrows and the Dead Horses tribe, Joshua and the courier made short work with the Whitelegs, destroying much of their forces and expelling the rest of them from Zion altogether. The few survivors of the Whitelegs escaped through Pine Creek Tunnel, traveling into a place the tribals called the Long Dark, an expansive system of near pitch-black corridors. Originally built by Vault-Tec before the war, the Long Dark was meant to act as a sort of escape tunnel in the event that its vault, Vault 74, ever needed to be evacuated. Didn't take long for the Whitelegs to discover this and go on to once more wreak havoc. After they had finished butchering the denizens of Vault 74, the Whitelegs pressed onwards, finally reaching the end of the Long Dark and entering the Divide, only to be killed by the Dustwalkers shortly after. Back in Zion, things had only gotten worse between Daniel and Joshua. Furious about what he and the courier had done, Daniel condemned Joshua for effectively turning the once passive Sorrows into just another band of savages. Joshua took little notice of Daniel's protests and instead doubled down. Over time, and under the watchful eye of Joshua, the Sorrows and the Dead Horses became nothing more than just another raider tribe in the wasteland, just like the Whitelegs before them. Daniel was predictably beside himself. Once more he made his feelings known to Joshua, and once more he was shut down. Worse yet, Joshua, fearing that Daniel might convince the Sorrows to return to their passive ways, ordered him to be cast out of Zion, and never to return. For a second time, Daniel was forced to turn his back on his home. Though unluckily for Joshua and his band of tribals, a new threat would emerge in Zion, one that simply couldn't be killed or ran out. A pathogenic fungus introduced to the canyon years ago had begun to reproduce rapidly. This pathogen entered the atmosphere, quickly spreading through the canyon as infections grew dramatically. Those infected with the fungus often suffered in great pain for days before ultimately dying of organ failure. Though dying was only half the problem. The corpses of those who had died from the pathogen would soon reanimate, their bodies now covered in a thick moss-like growth and attacking anyone around them on sight. These spore carriers only worsened the spread of the fungus and posed a clear and present danger to anyone still living in the canyon. Only a few years after the fungus spread, the spore carriers, in addition to the unlivable weather conditions, decimated all wildlife in Zion. Meanwhile, during his exile, Daniel had journeyed back to the home of the Dead Horses, Dead Horse Point, only to find that it had been burnt to the ground. Devastated, Daniel knew that he had to tell Joshua, and once more try and save the Sorrows from their violent ways. Entering Zion Canyon later that year, Daniel was met by a Sorrow hunting party and was brought before Joshua shortly after. Though initially hostile to his arrival, Joshua listened as Daniel told him the fate of Dead Horse Point and the many other horrors that had befallen the Mojave. Daniel was given refuge, and for a time, the two former friends seemed to make peace with one another, though that wasn't meant to last. Daniel and Joshua still clashed on what was right for the tribals, but more importantly, the two of them disagreed on how they should dispose of their dead. As more and more tribals died of the fungus, Daniel believed that the only way to ensure they wouldn't come back as spore carriers was to burn their corpses, a notion that Joshua refused to entertain. Having seen firsthand the horrors of fire, Joshua forbade the burning of corpses, despite Daniel's pleas. Though in time, Joshua's ability to lead came into question. Joshua was slowly dying, having been infected by the fungus not too long ago. In his last days alive, Joshua promoted his second-in-command, Follows Chalk, to acting war chief of the Dead Horses and Sorrows, just to spite Daniel. Once more, Daniel pleaded for the tribals to burn his body, only to be refused once again. Joshua had burned enough, and it was his time to be buried. Follows Chalk, now known as Leads with Chalk, took Joshua's body to one of the pre-war ranger stations in Zion, finally laying the burnt man to rest. In the months that followed, Zion only became more perilous. Attacks from the spore carriers, or moss men as the tribals had called them, only became more common. Daniel, despite the wishes of the tribals, began torching their corpses in the night, convinced it was the only way they could prolong their survival. Defenses were set up to ward off any future mossmen attacks, though it soon became clear that the tribals could no longer stay in Zion. The weather seemed to only worsen, as traces of the cloud from the Mojave began to enter. The toxins mixed with Zion's already polluted atmosphere, creating a sickly green fog that covered the entire canyon and aiding in spreading the fungus even further. On top of that, more and more reports were coming out about a supposed giant moss man stalking the now hazy corridors of Zion. It soon became clear to both Daniel and Leads with Chalk that they had no choice but to leave. Leads with Chalk ordered the exodus of Zion shortly after. Daniel and the rest of the tribals made their way to Pine Creek Tunnel, just as the Whitelegs did years ago, though instead of following them, Daniel chose to stay behind. Leads with Chalk and the rest of the tribals made the venture through the long dark, eventually making it to the other side, entering the divide just as the Whitelegs did years before. And just like the Whitelegs, both the Sorrows and the Dead Horses were attacked by the Dustwalkers. Those that had fled from the initial fighting made their way through the long dark once again, only to find that the tunnel had been sealed behind them by Daniel. The Dead Horses and Sorrows died there, trapped in the long dark, indirectly killed by the same man who once desperately tried to save them. On the other side of that door, Daniel had unfinished business. Hearing the rumors of the tall moss man and having seen it with his own eyes, Daniel took it upon himself to kill this monster, once and for all. Armed with an assortment of incendiary weapons and grenades, Daniel made his way up to one of the old ranger stations, ready to finish things once and for all. In the end, Daniel was never seen or heard from again. You could argue that Daniel died like so many others before him, suffering a slow death as the fungus shut down his organs, one by one. Some might even say he was killed by any number of the spore carriers running around Zion. But in the end, we all know what really killed him. Or more accurately, who did. Only one thing could have killed Daniel, and that was the monster that haunts Zion to this day. The unkillable abomination responsible for slaughtering anyone unlucky enough to find themselves in that godforsaken canyon. It could only have been the work of the Wendigo. But that is a story for another day.